of Isaiah chapter 15. Isaiah chapter 15. Thankful to be in the service this morning. Glad to see each one that's come this way to be with us. If you're visiting with us, thank you so much for coming to be with us this morning. Isaiah chapter 15 is where we're going to read. We'll be reading the first 3 verses of this chapter and probably turn to a few other places to get across the thought. Seemed like maybe for a little while, at least for me, the Lord's given me some thoughts to preach on Sunday morning that have been, pretty straightforward and for the most part, fairly practical messages. This morning, the Lord's given me kind of an odd thought, and not sure why, although my understanding of it's not required. The Lord didn't ask me just to understand why He wants me to do something, but just to do it. And that's what I'm going to try to do this morning. So I'm not going to tell you that I understand exactly why the Lord would send the message that He sent this morning, but I know He has a reason and a purpose for everything that He does, and so I just trust Him this morning. We've kind of maybe been around this idea a little bit and maybe mentioned it once or twice, but I don't know that I've ever just preached on this idea before. We'll begin reading in verse 1, Isaiah chapter 15, verse 1. The burden of Moab, because in the night hour of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. Because in the night Ker of Moab is laid waste and brought to silence. He has gone up to Bajith and to Dibon, the high places, to weep. Moab shall howl over Nebo, and over Medeba. On all their heads shall be baldness, and every beard cut off. In their streets they shall gird themselves with sackcloth on the tops of their houses, and in their streets every one shall howl, weeping abundantly. I'm going to stop reading there in verse 3. So what we're looking at is a lamentation for Moab, a lamentation for Moab about the conditions of what's going to take place there, of what God is going to do there, destroy these cities. And you see their reaction as being described by Isaiah, of course being led by the Spirit to do so, understand that, but he's describing their actions. He's describing their condition, which is a lamented condition. They're in a condition where they're in mourning. You see their heads being bald, their beards cut off, them in sackcloth. This is describing a place of mourning, a position of mourning. And that's what they're doing. They're mourning these cities that have been destroyed. They're mourning these places that have been torn down by the Lord. And so we're seeing that condition. To give you just a little bit of idea of Moab, to just give you a little bit of background on Moab. Moab they are the people who descended from the child that Lot and his oldest daughter had after they left Sodom. And you can remember that scenario if you go back and study that. The Lord took Sodom or took Lot out of Sodom, and that was when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah were previously cities in what we would describe later as the land of Moab. The land of Moab is located on the southeast bank of the Dead Sea. So if you know where the Dead Sea is at, if you have an understanding kind of that, the geography of that location, that gives you somewhat of understanding about where the city of, or rather the land of Moab is. And you give you kind of an idea about the people and where they descended from and where they came from and kind of what all's been following them for years. The Bible describes Moab as a place that's God's washpot. God used it for a purpose. And oftentimes you would see When people were getting away from the Lord, they would go into the place of Moab. That's where Elimelech and Naomi and their children went. They found wives there. Of course, even through that, the Lord brought great blessing in bringing Ruth out, the Moabitess. And so you kind of see that. It gives you a little bit of the understanding of the history. And so the Bible is telling us here that God is judging these two cities, and God is judging Moab for the sinful condition. God is judging Moab for their reliance upon false gods. Even here you see in verse 2 it says that he has gone up to describe the place itself as that he has gone up to Bajith and Dibon, which are the high places. The high places were places where they worship false gods. So they've gone up to worship these false gods, and to even in being brought to silence, they're going up and to seek them about what's taking place here and what's going on. And so you see them in this condition of lamenting and lamentation and in mourning and in sackcloth, corresponding to the idea that they've been brought to silence. I want you to notice that their lamentation, their sitting in sackcloth, is in direct relation to the idea that they've been brought to silence. That's one of the first things that we're told about these two places, that in the night they were destroyed, they were laid waste, and they've been brought to silence. There are times in our lives that you've probably heard the old saying that the silence is deafening. What does that mean? Have y'all heard that statement before? That you can't hear anything because of the silence. Sometimes we're in a condition or in a place where silence speaks volumes. That silence is very loud, and silence tells us a whole lot. And so this morning what we want to look at is the idea of silence, and maybe from a couple of different perspectives. Again, notice the condition that these people are in as they're being brought to silence. One of the things that happens when we find ourselves in awe is we find ourselves also in silence. And I think part of what at least part of it, is they've got no more rebellious things to say about the Lord. They've got no more things to utter about the judgment of God. They've got no more rebellious ideas, even though they're not going to lean upon the Lord, even though they're not going to follow the Lord. They've even continued, they turned back to, and went up to the high places, but they are brought to silence. They've got nothing else to say. Have you ever seen it be the condition where a person is in maybe a very rebellious attitude, and they've always got, maybe have something to say, and they've got, they're going to run their mouth or whatever it may be, and then something take place and they're brought to silence. They have nothing else to say. That's the condition of this city, or rather these cities here. They're being brought to silence. They're seeing God. They know why this has taken place. They are very aware of this place. And if you were to probably sit down and ask them, they may offer some type of excuse or something of the nature, but they know that the Lord has done this and they have nothing left to say. Sometimes we find ourselves in conditions or in a place where all we have is silence. I want you to turn with me real quick to Psalm 35. Psalm 35. And I want you to notice something that David says here about silence. Psalm 35. Psalm 35, verse 21. This is a prayer of safety. David is praying here for safety. He pleads with the Lord to do the right thing with him. You can imagine some of the times in David's life where he finds himself in very dangerous situations, as he spent a lot of time in his early years on the run from Saul and on the run from people who were seeking to kill him. And so the statement's made in verse 21. It says, yea, they opened their mouth wide against me and said, our eye hath seen it. This thou hast seen. O Lord, keep not silence. O Lord, be not far from me. Now, have y'all ever been in a place where the Lord is silent? Sometimes we find ourselves in condition where the Lord is silent. And there's a few different reasons for that. Sometimes we find ourselves in this place. We have to kind of, look at some things, think about some things, pray about some things, find out why it is that the Lord is silent. Because there's a few different reasons that could be the case. There's a few different reasons why it could be the case even here, but I think we can get a picture of why the Lord is being silent here with David. Sometimes it's the case that the Lord with us is silent. One of the reasons that could be the case is because we've gotten far away from the Lord. We've gotten ourselves into a condition that we can't hear from the Lord because we're too busy going our own direction. That we are going our direction, we're going our way, and that we have determined in our heart that of what we're going to do. We're going to go our direction. We're going to go our way. And remember that when we can't hear from the Lord, sometimes it's not because He's moved away, but because rather we've moved away from Him. And we've gotten ourselves in a position that we can't hear Him because we're not listening to what He has to say. Sometimes that it's just flat the case that the Lord's not speaking because we're too busy doing what we're wanting to do, and we're not listening to what the Lord has to say. And often what I've found, and probably you found it too, is it's not that the Lord's not speaking. It's more that we can't hear what He's saying because we don't have ears to hear. We've made up our own minds of the direction. We've made up our own minds of what we're going to do and the direction that we're going to go in life. And so we're not hearing from the Lord. And sometimes what that may look like is that we've come to a place in life to make a decision. We've come to a crossroads in life, and we've decided what we're going to do. Consider Lot for a moment, even as he was going down to Sodom and he pitched his tent that direction. You see Lot in that moment that he begins to descend to Sodom. And what I mean by that's not necessarily descending geologically or geography from the perspective of geography, but he's descending spiritually. He's going down the wrong road. And he's pitched his tent. A lot of times we use that idea that a person has made a decision, they're going that way, and sometimes what I'll say is they've pitched their tent. What does that mean? They've set their face. They've headed that direction. They've made up their mind. That's the way they're going. And it would seem that they're going that direction despite anything anybody else would have to say, even despite anything the Lord would have to say. And so maybe the Lord's still speaking and they're not listening. And often what will happen is a person to find themselves in a situation as if they're in that same condition as Lot, and they're heading in that direction that they say, I don't hear anything. Maybe something happens. And then they begin to say, Lord, why do these things happen? And they're failing to realize that it's because they pitched their tent the wrong direction. And so they're saying, Lord, help me see. Lord, help me see in which direction that I'm heading. And the Lord is going to continue to say the same thing He said the whole time. And you say, well, I can't hear Him. It's because you don't want to hear what He's got to say. Sometimes it's the case that the Lord has spoken and the Lord has told us what He wants us to do. But here's the thing, sometimes, in fact not sometimes, but most times, The things that the Lord asks us to do are difficult and uncomfortable, and we don't, in our own nature, fleshly nature, want to do them, because the nature is that the flesh warreth against the spirit against the flesh. That's the nature of things. And so often the things that we're led to do in the Spirit are not comfortable things. They're very difficult things. And say, well, I can't hear from the Lord. Well, don't expect Him to tell you something different than what He's already directed you to do. He's spoken, but you're not listening. So they say, well, what am I supposed to do? You're supposed to go back and do what He's asked you to do. And if you can't hear from the Lord, it could be that this is the reason why. Discernment in these situations is very important. That you be honest with yourself, that you humble yourself, and that you question, and that you see where you stand. Because sometimes the reason that you can't hear from the Lord, or that the Lord is silent, is because He's told us what to do and we're on our way to do it, and things get difficult. Have you ever been in a position where you know you're doing what you're supposed to be doing? You know without a doubt you followed the Lord, and He's verified that to you. He's shown you that. But things are very hard. The road's tough. And so if you found yourself in that place spiritually before, this morning I'm preaching to me on this one. Place I've found myself lately. Times are hard. And just because the Lord's led us down a road doesn't mean that that road's always going to be easy. Sometimes the roads are hard. Sometimes the road is a test meant to strengthen, to give you patience, to help you, to train you. And it's a difficult road. And so we began to ask and we seek, and Lord, why are things so hard? And we just don't hear anything from the Lord. I try not to preach about all of this. I don't want to just beat the same horse over and over again. Well, just a week or two ago, I was struggling. Some of the things that we got going on in our life, and one morning I was up early, talking to the Lord, sitting up watching the sunrise. And I said, Lord, I need some help. That it seems like everything in my life right now is falling apart. Can you help me? And the Lord reminded me. He said, and this is what the direction the Lord reminded me. He said, you sought me before you did what you did. You know I've led you in this direction. You know I've guided you in every decision that you've asked me about. And that where you're sitting right today, you're sitting because I've led you there. He said, trust me. Now they say, well, that doesn't sound like silence. Well, He's not telling me anything about the road I'm on, in that this is the reason it's difficult, and this is why I'm doing all of this, and I'm going to all of this kind of thing. What He said was, trust me. Trust me. Sometimes we find ourselves on a tough road, and we're doing what God's asked us to do, but the Lord is silent. What can you do in those situations? Trust Him. Trust Him. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place where the Lord is quiet. I think about the Lord Jesus Christ. The Bible tells us that He was as a lamb, He was dumb before His shearers. And what did He answer as all of those men were mocking Him? And they were asking him these questions before they crucified him. Their intent was not to know the answer. They were speaking to the Lord spitefully. And what did Jesus answer? Not a word. And if you're speaking to the Lord disrespectfully, and if you're speaking and questioning the Lord in a way that is disrespectful towards Him, don't expect an answer from Him. If you're speaking and you're questioning everything the Lord's given and the Lord's telling you to do, don't expect an answer from Him. He's told you what to do. Next, you talk about silence. Not only are there times where the Lord is silent, but there are times in life where we are expected to be silent ourselves. One of the scriptures that's been on my mind a lot for myself, because y'all probably know me probably a lot of ways better than I know myself, you know. But I tend to be anxious. I tend to outrun myself sometimes. And one of the things that the Lord has constantly just been putting on my mind is be still. Be still. And I think a part of what that goes along with that, the verse doesn't necessarily say it, but be still and know that I am God. I think a part of that's not just be still, but be quiet. Stop talking. Stop trying to figure it out. Stop trying to do all of this, but just be still and be quiet. And let me work. And let me do. And listen to me. Sometimes the idea of being quiet. And let me put it to you this way. I think silence in itself is a form of worship. Not in a corporate sense. I'm not talking about that from a corporate point of view. There's times that we are to be silent, and I understand that. There's times I think we should, respectfully so. But I think also when we see God for who He is, when we truly worship Him in our heart, there is quite often times where we can't say anything. Have y'all ever been to a place where you've tried to pray and you can't come up with words, you're just silent? Words fail you. And that really in your prayer all you have is silence. And silence in itself is a prayer. I believe that with all my heart. Because words fail you. And sometimes I believe silence is a better prayer than when we open our mouths. You ever been in a place, you think about this, have you ever been in a place, maybe Christmas morning or something like that, and it's been real special? And Christmas morning, you kind of look at it from two different perspectives. Your kids wake up and they run in there and look at the Christmas tree and all of that and run through those presents real quick. And they say, is this all? And how respectful is that? You know, we treat the Lord that way if we're not careful. Then maybe one of those Christmas mornings they run in there and then they can't say anything. They're brought to silence. Sometimes the Lord can bring us to silence just with the blessings that He gives us. There's really nothing that we can say. Words fail us. So we're brought to silence when we see the goodness of God. And when we see the glory of God. And when we see Him for who He is. And not just in physical possessions or things that He might bless us with physically. But when we get to the place that in our heart we see God for who He is. It's a form of worship that He's so great in our hearts at the moment that we can't say a word, that words fail us. Nothing to say. We see Him high and lifted up. We'll go a little bit further with that. I want to give you an example. And before I give you this example, let me say this. I use a lot of natural examples when I preach. Sometimes it helps us understand things a little bit more. My intent's to never preach the example, but to preach the spiritual concept. So don't walk away with the example. Walk away with the spiritual concept. That's what I want you to understand. But do y'all remember a time when adults had conversations and children didn't? Why was that taught? If you had a bunch of adults talking and a child butted in, how'd that go over? Because children were meant to be seen and not heard, right? I was taught that as well. I had to learn that lesson a couple of times because I didn't get it the first time because I always had something to say. Sometimes I was a little too smart for my own good. I thought I knew something, but I did not know what I thought I knew. Sometimes looking back, I can see it, that our children think that they have something to interject, and often they interject something in adult conversation, and they think they know what they're talking about, but often they don't. Why? There's a lot of life they hadn't experienced yet. And the depth of the things that we're conversing about, they failed to understand at this point in life yet. And while what they think may make sense in their own mind, given the experience that we've gained in the older generations, you can quickly see that they have not learned those things yet. I wonder if that's the same way it is with the Lord. Again, don't get the example, get the spiritual concept. I'm not standing up here telling you and preaching that children ought to be silenced in the presence of elders. That's not what I'm preaching. I'm preaching that we ought to be silenced in the presence of God. Because oftentimes we interject to the Lord and we, Lord bless this one, Lord bless that one, Lord do this, Lord do that, when we fail to recognize that He is God and that He is perfect. And sometimes what we ought to say is nothing at all, but rather let Him be who He is. And realize that His thoughts are not our thoughts, and that His ways are not our ways, but that they are far and exceeding above us, and that He has far more experience than we have. And I'll tell you, in a lot of ways, I'll put it this way, the point is this, that oftentimes we speak because we think we have something to add to the conversation. And oftentimes we speak to the Lord because we think we have something to add. And that's a spirit of pride. It comes from pride in our heart that we think we have something to add when we have not at all, and we fail to realize who He is and how much He knows. Sometimes we fail to respect our older generation because we think that they don't have anything to add. But the truth is they have years above us, and we'd be wise to listen to them. I didn't gather this by intention. I'm not trying to pin any roses on me. But when me and Crystal started dating, eventually got married, along the way, of course, I met her family, and one of the men that I met in her family is her great-grandfather, Brother Paul Stevens. And he was a brilliant man in the Bible. I was sitting talking to him one day. We went over to his house. They had a little family get-together. And everybody was talking. Everybody, kind of gathering around. And me and Brother Paul were sitting in a couple of chairs talking. Or rather, he was talking. And I was listening. If you had a Bible conversation with Brother Paul, that's what you did. You listened. Brother Paul had a lot of knowledge about the Scripture. And one of them came by and told me, they said, Brother Trent, as long as you sit there, he's going to keep talking. And I said, I want to sit here long as he'll keep talking. Because there's a fountain of information right there that I need to know. And what I was trying to say is that this man's lived years, and he's had years of Bible study that I have not had. I want to know what he knows. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that our elders have years of experience on us, and that we would do well to be silent, even in their presence at times, and hear what they have to say, and listen to them. Now go back for a moment. Just think about this. When the Bible describes God in the book of Daniel, I believe it's chapter 9, if my memory serves me right, I have to go back and look. But do y'all remember how the Bible describes God there in the book of Daniel? I'm just going to turn over. I remember the name. I just don't remember exactly what verse and place it is. I'm gonna have told y'all wrong. It's chapter 7, verse 9. We kind of think of God and how the Bible describes Him. How many of you older folks have a birthday and you're ready to broadcast how old you are? Most folks they kind of want to keep that a secret. Right? You get to a birthday and say, how old are you? Brother Paul didn't. He was always, he's 93. I'm 93. Look pretty good for a 93-year-old. That's what he'd tell me. Lived to be 100. And he was what we consider an old man, but he was thankful for his age. But how does the Bible describe the age of God? Daniel chapter 7, verse 9. I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit. How old is He? That's a question that we come up with. And there is no number, because God's not bound by time. But the Bible describes Him as the Ancient of Days, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of His head like pure wool. And I don't think that, I understand that white is a symbol of purity and all of that, and I think that's part of it, but I don't believe that's all of it. I think the Bible is kind of giving us a description of God as a person with white hair because of the age that's on Him. Why? Because it's a description of the wisdom that He has gained, being the Ancient of Days, and the discretion that He has, and the knowledge that He knows, and the understanding that's in Him. Why? That we would do well to be silent in His presence and listen when He's speaking. Every time that you hear the idea of keeping silence in the Bible, it's always in relation to the person of God and who He is. Let me give you some verses about that since we're right here. Turn back to Ecclesiastes. This one you're probably aware of. I've used it a time or two. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Verse 1, keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to offer the sacrifice of fools, or to run your mouth, is what he's saying. Be more ready to hear than they offer the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. Be silent before God. For God is in heaven. You see the silence in direct connection to the person of God. When we see God for who He is, we shut our mouths because we have nothing to say. Because God is in heaven and we upon earth. The book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk. Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. Habakkuk. chapter 2. Habakkuk chapter 2, all the way at the end. Verse 19. Woe unto him that saith to the wood, let's start about idols, awake, it shall teach. Behold, is it laid over with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in the midst of it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Silence in direct connection with who he is and how great he is. One more. Job chapter 40. Job 40. Last one. Remember that Job failed to understand. He began to utter a few things before the Lord and trying to understand what in the world's going on with him. And then Job 38, God began to question Job. If you think you're so smart, answer a few questions for me. You know, sometimes I read that just to remind myself. The Lord answered Job out of a whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Yeah, thank you, somebody. Words without knowledge. Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I'll demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou have understanding. The Lord's putting him in his place for 2 or 3 chapters, and he just keeps going. I mean, it's just all the way to the end of the book, the Lord's just putting Job in his place. So what does Job say? Chapter 40, verse 1. More of the Lord answered Job and said, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. What's Job saying? I'm going to shut up. I'm going to shut my mouth. And I'm going to be silent before the Lord. And I'm going to let the Lord do what seemeth good to him. And I'm going to listen. I'm going to be quiet before the Lord. Oftentimes we find ourselves, if we're not careful, in a place of pride. How do you know you're prideful? Because you're instructing God on what he needs to do. You have the answers. If you find yourself in a place where you got the answers, you're being very prideful. So what are we to do? We're to follow not the head of you. We're to follow the head, Christ. That means we're not to speak, but to listen and to hear what he would have to say. This morning, that's why the Bible tells us, and that's why the Bible instructs the churches in the book of Revelation, first, the second, third chapter, in the letters that Jesus wrote, any man that hath an ear to hear, let him hear. Now, Jesus is not saying that a person just, everybody got ears to hear what he's saying. If you will stop and be quiet long enough and listen, that maybe today we need to stop long enough to be silent before the Lord, to realize who he is, and to hear his instruction, and to hear what he would have to say, and be quiet before him, and let the Lord speak. Today we be like Job and put our hands over our mouth and hear what God would have to say. This morning, if you're here and lost, stop with the excuses. Stop with the things that you are uttering back. Every time the Lord convicts you and shows you where you stand, stop coming up with excuses and open your ears and listen. Hear what he has to say. And what he is telling you this morning is that you have no chance without him. You are lost. You are undone. You are a sinner. And that without the Lord Jesus Christ, you will go to hell. There is no other way of salvation. Listen to the Lord this morning and trust him, which he is bidding you to do. This morning, would you be silent before the Lord and listen to him and trust him this morning while we have a verse of a song.